out and hopefully have a discussion about Israel, the environment, our region, what's been, what's going on, and what needs to happen. I'll start with maybe just a little bit about myself. I moved to Israel basically when I was 17. I grew up in a family that was always very Zionist in its perspective, and really went to Israel and felt very much at home there. And after I finished the army, I went to law school in Jerusalem, subsequently did a doctorate in environmental science, and returned to Israel and did everything I could to stay out of government. There was a new Ministry of Environment at the time, and I started a public interest environmental law group, which launched me on basically the bulk of my career, which has been as an environmental advocate. I started a new public interest environmental law group, something like your NRDC or Sierra Club Legal Defense, and then chaired the umbrella organization of, which is now 120 environmental organizations in Israel. We always joke that there's 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, 4 environmental groups in Israel. I'm sure you know the phenomenon. But like many of my colleagues in Israel, although we could point to a whole series of successes in our efforts to try to improve the environmental performance of our country, we often felt that we had reached a glass ceiling, that the tools available to civil society, which are remarkable, we have a Supreme Court, which I think has the most liberal standing rules in the world. Public interest groups can criminally indict and try polluters. We can have our day in court if we think the government is not complying with its own laws or is not being acting as it might environmentally and otherwise. But the big decisions ultimately are political decisions, and many of us felt that after many years of working, the indicators in our country in terms of the environment were really negative. And that's what motivated us to try to perhaps roll up our sleeves and leave the comfort of NGOs and civil society and throw ourselves into those murky waters of political action and involvement. Israel's environmental performance, it's not all negative. There are some, I think, remarkable things we've done, and I think if you're going to be fair, and I try to be fair, although I make a living out of criticizing the country, but I do try to be balanced. I mean, I think some of the things we've done in terms of water management are unprecedented worldwide, in terms of our utilization of wastewater, in terms of the development and dissemination of drip irrigation. In terms of forestry, we made a lot of mistakes, but I just now finished a book. I'm finishing a sabbatical at Stanford, and just finished a book on Israel's forestry practices, and I think there's no country in the world that has the kind of record we do, where basically 100 years ago there was no trees left in the country after 2,000 years of a litany of conquerors. We can see the aerial photographs from the time of the First World War, when the British reconnaissance took photos of the area, and there's just nothing there. There's 2 little patches of trees, one in the Haifa Carmel area, and the other one in the Galilee and the Meron, and that was it. We know from the Bible, and now we know from all kinds of pollen samples, that there was a lot of trees. So Israel now has about 8.5%, actually closer to 9% tree cover, and we'll probably get to 10% until we finish the areas that we've zoned for. 25% of the country is supposed to be for nature preservation, so it hasn't all been negative. But my sense is that the big issues we were losing, and I'll talk about some of the problems and some of our solutions. But it wasn't only the environment which we felt Israel was, how should I put it, disappointing ourselves and what we believed the country could be. The country of Israel was established, I believe, to be a light unto the nations, to be a unique society which is just, which pursues peace, which offers, I think, an expression of the best of Jewish values, if you look at the prophets, and the commitment to social justice and creativity and fairness. And what we've seen in the last couple of decades is a country that once led the world in terms of what they call the Gini coefficient, a measure of social equity or equality, all of a sudden was falling almost behind that of the United States, that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poor, and the policies of the government were pushing us in that direction. So on the one hand, Israel constitutes an astonishing economic success. If you just look at the very narrow numbers which we tend to look at when we measure economic success, some things like GNP, Israel now produces $30,000 per capita. That's more than Spain. It's more than a lot of countries in Southern Europe. Recently, Sanda came around. We hosted a leading environmentalist from Kenya, and she reminded me that when Kenya was independent, its economic status was comparable to that of Israel, a very poor, developing country. And yet, we've managed to really grow our economy. The problem is that 25% of the country used to be below the poverty line, say in 1979. Today, we're members of the OECD, we're richer than ever, and a third of the country lives below the poverty line. There's a lot of reasons for this, and I'll maybe discuss them tonight, but that's just one indication of the fact that we feel that the basic axiom or the basic commitment to providing equality of opportunity is slipping away from us, and that we need to change directions. So this issue of sustainability is really not just only about the air quality in the country, which needs to get better, not just about the water, groundwater resources, or the loss of biodiversity. It's also about trying to make a society where people feel that they have a fair shot and that there's not economic discrimination, not ethnic discrimination, and the like. So, like I said, a large group of the environmental movement decided that it was time to go and move over into the political realm. And 4 months before the last election, we established a Green Party called the Green Movement. And it was a fairly bold move. We weren't anticipating the elections. They came a little bit early. Israel has a somewhat unstable system of government, and all of a sudden you could wake up one day and lose a vote of confidence, and we're back at an election. So we decided that we weren't going to blink, and we were going to go ahead and run. And for a brief period before the elections, we made a run of it. We were up to about 3%, which means at the time I was third on the list. I was the deputy chair of the party. We have I'll explain the system a little bit later. But subsequently there was a war in Gaza. It's awfully hard to talk about some of these issues of environmental equality and social justice when 1.5 million Israelis are in bomb shelters, literally trying to save their lives and those of their children from rockets that are coming in from a hostile neighbor. And our numbers dropped, and we never really, even though the war ended before the elections, we never really managed to recoup the numbers that we'd had, and only ended up with 1% of the vote, which is enough for a seat in the Knesset, in the parliament, but the law says you have a minimum of 2 seats. So here we are now, a couple of years later, and we are looking to the future. And although I took a leave of absence because I promised my wife and daughter that we would have a sabbatical, in about 2 weeks' time I'll be back talking to Israelis just in forums like this, often 2 times a night, 3 times a night, trying to explain to them why a Green Party is important for Israel, why we're fundamentally different than other political alternatives. And so I'll try to share those values with you. I don't know, besides Sandra, if there are other Green Party members here. Are there other Green Party members here? Oh, this is wonderful. It's a majority. So I express my solidarity. And I'm sure you share my overall conviction that as the mosaic of politics changes in the world, a green political perspective is going to become a permanent part of the political landscape. Now the United States, with its 2-party system, makes this very, very difficult. But even the United Kingdom, with its first past the post system, has recently elected to its parliament a Green Party member. And at the local level, we all know that the Green is really almost the only political party that offers a perspective and an agenda which is compelling. And I really believe that. And what I'd like to share with you is maybe some of the elements of a Green Party which are uniquely Israeli, and what we are thinking about. I'd like to get your feedback, especially if you're Green Party members, and answer your questions and share your thoughts both tactically and strategically about what a Green Party can be. So what I think I'll do is, before I throw it up into questions, I'll talk about 5 values. When people say, why should we vote for a Green Party? I say, well, our values are fundamentally different. And I believe that when I try to distill down our message, the environmental and the social messages come from comparable, the similar values, and they're all Jewish values. So I'm going to share some of those with you and how they manifest themselves in Israel's reality, and hopefully it'll resonate, and we'll hear what you have to say. So the first thing I want to talk about that is important to the Green Party of Israel is thinking in the long term. In other words, there's an expression in Hebrew, lachshov yarok, lachshov rachok, it even rhymes, think green, think far. And when we ran our campaign, the slogan or the symbol was we had a big photograph, giant photo of a little itty-bitty baby, and it had one line, if he could only vote. Okay, because we felt that we were the only party that represented an agenda which offered something promising to the future generations. I say this as a Jewish value. It's a very famous, what we call midrash, a story from the Talmud, where a famous rabbi named Honi, the circle maker, approached an old man, an 80-year-old man planting a tree, and he challenged him. He said, this is crazy. What are you planting a tree for? You're never going to see the fruits. And the old man smiled and said, well, just as my father planted trees for me and his father planted trees for me, of course I'm going to plant this tree. And this sense of intergenerational justice is something which is very, very important to us. So the problem is that myopia has become part of the national DNA in Israel. And there are reasonable historic and sociological explanations. When you have existential threats for over 60 years, you tend to think in the short term. But that means that you get locked into a system where it's all tactics and it's no strategy and there's no long-term thinking. Surely in the environment, many of our environmental problems are associated with this kind of short-term time horizon. You cannot, for example, tap all the waters out of the lower Jordan River and send them down to make the desert bloom with all that importance and not realize that very soon thereafter the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on Earth, the lowest saltwater lake on Earth, is going to start disappearing and turning into something comparable to the Aral Sea. Because that you don't even have to be a prophet for. That's just common sense. It's 1 billion cubic meters of water a year, which used to flow down the River Jordan, which are no longer there. It's not only Israel. Syria is doing a lot of the diversions. Jordan has tapped in there. But basically, the only thing flowing into the Dead Sea these days is putrid sewage and very salty stream water. And I refuse to be part of the generation that lets the Dead Sea die. And I think that any kind of long-term perspective and sense of intergenerational justice compels us to do better. But that same value is just as true for education. Because if we don't offer all Israelis the best possible education, we're not going to have the kind of future in our country that we need. There are some magnificent schools in Israel. If you live in the right neighborhood, or if you can afford to pay the costs of a tutor. And I'm living this year in the Palo Alto area, so I can see some of the similarities between the Palo Alto and East Palo Alto dynamics, as opposed to some of the situations in southern Tel Aviv versus northern Tel Aviv with the light. But there is a clear sense that if we want to really do better and create a society that is healthy, that has solidarity, that believes in itself enough together to fight this fight for survival, we're going to have to do better in that social justice. So that's the first point I would say that makes us different, that we really feel that we need to change our priorities and think about the long term and what we can do to make sure that our children's and grandchildren's life is better than our own.